Hey, so today on the Change Agent interview series, I am honored to welcome Elizabeth Walters. Elizabeth is chair of the Ohio Democratic Party and president of Summit County Council. And this is a special interview because, as you may know, we typically interview clients and partners, folks within our network. Elizabeth came to us as sort of a friend of Muse, and I was very curious to hear a little more about change in the world of politics, which, as we all know, is not easy. So let's just start with a little bit of background. Can you tell me about how does one, get into politics to begin with?
Well, great to be here with you and love that question. I get it frequently. I think there's a lot of mystery around politics. Certainly, there's a lot of mystery for folks around running for public office. But the reality is that most of us in the work, whether it's in an elected office or working on the political operative side, tend to come to this for personal reasons because something happened to our family, something happened to us, something happened to our community that we didn't like. And we wanted to see something different happen, particularly from a policy standpoint or from a power standpoint. And so we get involved, and there's a whole bunch of entry points for folks along the way. For some folks, they start to work in it, which is how I kind of got into politics. I started as an intern on a campaign and then was hired on to President Obama's first presidential campaign. And that was the kind of beginning of my journey. Other folks come to it through volunteering. Honestly, some of the most common places where we meet people is, like PTA volunteers who then run for school board, who then run for their city council. So those entry points are everywhere, and everyone's story is a little bit different.
Sure. So get involved.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Tell us a little more about your role as chair of the Democratic Party for Ohio. So what are your responsibilities in that role?
Yeah, so the chairmanship is an elected role. I'm elected by about 160 people who serve as the governing body of the Ohio Democratic Party. And there's a very similar structure on the other side of the aisle. So the Republican Party runs much the same way. And so when you are elected as chair, you campaign among a very small group of people. You are elected, and then you essentially become the CEO of what is the largest political infrastructure group in Democratic politics in a state. So I'm the chair in Ohio. I have counterparts all over the country. Everyone's setup is a little bit different, but essentially we all function as a CEO type. And our primary job is to raise the resources we need. So to raise money to run an organization that can support candidates. To put it a little more simply, our job is to build roads that candidates drive their cars on. So we are here to build that infrastructure to connect our candidates to voters in the neighborhoods where they live through grassroots organizing, through local events, through hosting house meetings, and from good old-fashioned canvassing. But we also build roads in the digital world. So we're here to build audiences online that our candidates can connect to through storytelling and the sharing of their ideas and their own message and their own brand in online platforms. There's a little bit more to it than that, but a lot of my job is really, I spend most of my time in meetings with our stakeholders or with donors. I spend a lot of time in spreadsheets, figuring out where the dollars are going, and if we're really abiding. We have lots of rules in political spending that we have to follow, so a lot of regulatory discussions, and then management, right? Managing a really big team that grows and then contracts depending on the time of year. So right now we're pretty small. We'll probably maintain a staff of about 20 over the next 6 months, but in an even year election, like the presidential campaign or a Senate race, we'll grow as big as 200 or more people on staff. So the job changes a lot. It's never boring.
So how does this compare with the balance of your role as in local politics as president of Summit County Council? Are you, it sounds to me like there's a lot of policy change going on in that role versus the fundraising and the infrastructure builds and the other role. How do those two things balance each other out?
I think they really inform one another. The jobs are very different by kind of practice and how the time is spent and the work you do. So in Summit County, for example, We have an executive and a council form of government. Us in Cuyahoga County, where you guys are the only two in the state that function like this. Most of the rest have a 3-commissioner system. So council is inherently more of a part-time job. It's not seen as a full-time job at the county level. And really our job as a legislative body of a county is we're essentially an oversight entity, right? We approve budgets, we approve expenditures, we approve contracts. We do some other policy stuff in there too, but it's the biggest part of our work. So there is some overlap in like really needing to understand complex budgeting and complex spending, because the county, similar to my other role, is a very complex entity with lots of different sources of dollars, different regulatory structures. We are the administrative arm of the state. And so we have our fingers in every part of the government that you often don't see: roads, bridges, sewers, who buys the rock salt for the highways. Turns out that's the county government. We spend a lot of time talking about the price of rock salt. So it's a lot
Sure.
of minutia inside a big picture. So I think those two things are really similar. But the difference really is, right, political side is how you get someone to the seat of governance. And then governance from there on out is a much different matter. And it really turns over to the citizens to hold folks accountable, or to other kind of advocacy groups. And I think one of the things that really helps my work on the party chair side is that, being a local candidate running for office myself, it's a very unique viewpoint to understand, who are the kind of candidates that we want to recruit? What are the values they hold? What are the fundamental skill sets they need to be successful? And it's not as, I don't want that to sound daunting. A lot of women kind of have, particularly women running for office, have imposter syndrome. It's really not as complicated as it may seem from the outside. But so for me, it's how do I take that knowledge and make it easier and more accessible for more folks to join the work in terms of running for office and serving in local government, or even in Congress or the US Senate.
Certainly. And you've talked to me in just sort of our pre-discovery meeting for this conversation about this concept of storytelling and sparking that interest and carrying through that decision. So can you talk to me about the role of storytelling in your work, whether it's storytelling to change a mind or a policy, or storytelling to really change someone's mindset as it relates to their own potential within this framework?
Absolutely. I think that there's really no more powerful tool in politics, or frankly, in a lot of any role where you need to connect to other humans to bring them along on a journey with you. Storytelling is a critical tool. We all do it in a little bit of a different way, and we obviously use it for different reasons. I think politics is very unique because it's probably the only industry where, while you're telling your story, someone else is telling a very different story about you that's often very unflattering, right? So it's not quite like, we're not in kind of in product marketing, and that it's not quite the same, but there's a lot of overlap. And really, when you break it down, there's a organizing guru on the left, a guy named Marshall Gans, who was integral in starting the farm worker movement out on the West Coast several decades ago. And he now is kind of a Yoda to a lot of us who've come up in different organizing programs. And Marshall talks a lot about the power of story to unite us, to inspire us, and then to set our path forward. So it's the story of self. Who am I, and why am I doing this work, or why am I here in this fight? Who are we? The story of us. What do us as a movement, what are we capable of? What can we accomplish working together? And the story of now. Why is this moment now the right moment for this fight? What is the urgency to our work, and how do we tackle the work ahead of us? Like, what's everyone's role, and how does it all come together? And so those three pieces are really a powerful tool, I think, for any leader. If you want to lead a team, if you want to have folks come to you, come into your movement, come into your effort that maybe you don't know it very well, it's storytelling helps others see the likeness. What are the values that we share? How are we connected? It helps people understand their power. How does the work that we're doing together matter? What is the change that we can make together? It also helps us all to find purpose, to really understand that working in these spaces, or whatever it is, we can move forward and accomplish this great big thing. Sometimes it'll take time. Incremental change is powerful. But for me, that's really a part of what drew me to politics. I mentioned originally in an earlier part of this discussion that my first paid job on a campaign was for President Obama's first campaign in '08. And, that was really for me because of the stories he told about himself, where I identified my family had gone through a medical bankruptcy my senior year in college that had really transformed my understanding of the world. I grew up in a very, comfortable middle class lifestyle. My mom was a nurse, and if I ever needed anything, she just worked some overtime. And essentially, when you are faced with a medical emergency and you're living paycheck to paycheck, like many other families, we had this kind of like, oh crap moment of, we are not prepared for this moment of emergency when someone can't work or can't work overtime or faced with a huge set of unexpected expenses. And through this process, there's this guy named Barack Obama, who's at that time running for the US Senate, who is telling the story about his mom's own struggle with cancer and fighting the insurance companies at the end of her life. And I thought, man, this guy, he's just like me, right? Like, we live in different states, we have very different lives, but he really gets my family's journey. And like, I'm all in. I'm here for this healthcare reform discussion. I think it's so important. And that's really how I came into the work. And I've ever since then, and it's a big part of the training and those campaigns, is how do we talk about the work so that people feel inspired to join and to come along?
I love that. And I just want to repeat that framework for others who may be listening, because I think even as a marketer, I can take a lot away from this concept of story of self, story of us, and story of now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes, we stop at the story of self. I know brands will just talk all about themselves and their features and benefits and why they're so great, yet they'll stop where it comes to telling the story of what happens when you partner together with that product or service and why that's so important to do now. So sort of carrying through that. But one thing I have a question about, especially around politics, is the story of self, I think, can sometimes get in the way because of how people identify to their party.
Mm-hmm.
I am a Republican or I am a Democrat versus I
Yeah.
vote Republican or I vote Democrat. Those are two very different things. And I often feel like that identification can hold someone back from then hearing the story of us and the
Yeah.
story of now.
It's so true. And kind of to your point about a brand working with a product, right? I think politics is perhaps the only space in which, in the course of a campaign or an election or whatever it is, our discourse is not just about us. If to comparative, it'd be like Campbell's Soup selling a can of tomato soup and someone else saying that it kills babies. Like, that's a much different dynamic. And that's really the dynamic we face in political life today, particularly in the United States and particularly online, where it's the Wild West. There's no rules, there's no guidelines, and often are kind of left to our own discernment and judgment, which anyone will tell you in the heat of a campaign can get a little skewed and we all become a little tunnel visioned. But I think one of the important features about the story of us, the story of self, story of us, is that it invites the person who is telling that story not to tell the story and that is the end of the purpose, right? It is actually to tell the story and an invitation to invite others to share back with you about their own identity, their own story, their own journey, as a way to find a mutual point of understanding or seeing self in self, seeing yourself reflected back in other people. And so one of the most important tools that organizers learn early, especially those who've got good training, is it's not enough to speak. You must also learn to listen. And you can't just listen in order to respond. You listen to hear and then really process and repeat back what others are sharing with you. And so, as particularly for really talented politicians, you'll know, and obviously the easiest ones to point to are the ones that everybody knows, the Bill Clintons of the world, the Barack Obamas of the world, who could really not just tell their own story, but carried the stories of others with them to show that there was more than just themselves in that moment, in that policy fight, in that political fight, in that quest to build power. And I think those are some of the important tools that good political operatives and good politicians really learn along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you alluded to something earlier as it relates to the internet and the Wild West and
Mhm.
how selective people can
Yes.
be with what they choose to consume online. I'd like to hear a little more about communication techniques that you're using to overcome this like sort of deep-rooted confirmation bias that we find ourselves in. This is very different than, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when people might have come across a differing opinion and be willing to maybe
Um,
entertain it. Now
yeah.
they don't even have that opportunity because they're so deep
Mhm.
into their belief system.
Yeah. And it's so true. Like we live in such siloed worlds, and I think if anybody out there, anybody who is in this space, just going home, coming out of the holidays, right? It's the perfect example of you spend time with family who may not have the same political ideology as you. And when you sit down, and it's like you're talking past each other because we're operating in
Yeah.
completely separate realities, particularly online. It's kind of astounding, really. And so
Mhm.
we're left with two challenges, which is the tactics, right? What tactics can we deploy in the most effective way? And some of it, to be honest, is just like brute force. You just spend to try and break through algorithms as much as possible and just bludgeon people over the head with a message on repeat again and again and again in a very short amount of time. That works, right? It can be effective to in terms of a winning a moment, but for those of us who are in more movement work or building long-term stuff, we really have to work on two things, which is cultivating an audience, right? Which includes people who don't agree with us, because a huge important part of political life is persuading people who are like, listen, as a democratic operative in particular, there are people who we're just never going to win, and we don't spend time talking to them because we're never going
Sure.
to win them. But there is a huge chunk of the country that's in the middle, and so how do we cultivate the audience? And that's both a tactical question for us of what does it look like to get hyper local with message delivery, to drill down almost, we work with a partner that actually comes out of corporate world that works in the franchise model of how do we take our message and break it down to a franchise level so that every person that consumes our information is from a local lens, as a Summit County voter or a Warren County voter. But then it's also about building community, building spaces online where we don't necessarily I think script it, but we ensure that there's a lot of community rule following, that there's a certain culture that develops in that online community that is respectful of opinions, allows informed and productive conversation. And really, I think that's where those two pieces at the best half is audience and community are critical, because community is the place where when people go looking for something, if there's nothing there to find, they tend to go deeper into their own silo. So just having a place as an option. So like, obviously I speak in the political language, but there's a reason why folks and people have different opinions about this. Like the QAnon space is so impenetrable because it is kind of the only thing of its kind. And so they've created it's a community. There's a lot of
Sure.
affirmation. There's kind of confirmation and reinforcement of a set of values and views from other human, like that. It's not that it was just like really catchy marketing, it's that there was a
Right.
community of people. And so how do we create the alternative? How do we create a space for people who are likewise looking for information or kind of the opportunity to learn? And that's really the most important part of the work for us.
Yeah, and you speak of all kinds of, marketing related activity, everything from, defining your persona, targeting hyper localization of communication. It's all the same. And I've never worked in political communication, but I'm always fascinated to observe it, uh, and especially when it's effective.
Yeah.
And I loved what you said about winning a moment versus building a movement. These are
Mhm.
two different, very different approaches. And I think my last question is around if you would choose, like, whether it's a moment or a movement building activity that you've done where you've really been immersed in change, um,
Mhm.
Talk to me about the process of that change and how you've sort of seen it through to fruition. Because from an outsider's perspective, it seems like it takes a lot of energy.
That is true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the hard part about any kind of infrastructure or durable movement building in politics is that, in public, or sorry, in private business, right, you're bound by deadlines set by yourself, right? Whether that is, I mean, sort of, if you have shareholders, sort of by them and based on how much money they expect to make over time. For us, we are, for politics in particular, and for electoral politics, we are a long-term entity. So the Ohio Democratic Party has been in existence as long as the state of Ohio, and will be as long, because that was part of the requirement to join the union, right? You had to have two political parties.
Mhm.
And but we are bound by recurring short-term deadlines over and over and over again, where you either win or you lose. There is no second place. It's either you either win or you don't, right?
Right.
And so, and in some instances, in some years, we have multiple deadlines in a year. So going into 2023, it's a municipal election year. And so we've got municipal elections, some primaries, some general, May, June, August, September, and then the November election. So we actually have 5, right, deadlines that are recurring over the course of 1 year. So to your point about brute force versus movement building, it can just be a real challenge to establish even like what does success really look like for us. Kind of, we
Sure.
know it or see it. And I think one of the examples of an organization that I worked with early was a group. It's actually based in Cleveland, and it now has a footprint in 5 states. It's called Red, Wine, and Blue, and it is a political-ish organization. It's a 501c4 that is really targeted at helping women in the suburbs of all races, all ages, identify their political power and understand what is at stake for their kids' schools, for their right to choose and make their own healthcare decisions, their economic power. And it does it in a really fun way that is focused really on this community building piece. So when we first launched it, we did it with the intention of never actually having an office or having community-based office space ever. It was meant to be a completely virtual space, because we know that most moms, particularly in the burbs, they're busy, right? They've got school drop off, they got soccer, they got PTA, they got jobs, they've got all these things. And so how are we creating a space that, like, when they're sitting in line waiting to pick their kids up at school, they can turn on their phone, get a little bit of information about an important issue, and take action all in one 5-minute gap? And so as we designed and built to that end, it was really, functionality was key. It was really trying to get into to kind of, I imagine what private sector marketing does, is trying to get into the life of the person we're trying to reach and pull into our community, and design towards that end, towards that need, towards that moment when they're like, man, I'm really annoyed at what's happening at my kid's school board meeting. This is crazy. Like, we want our kids to be safe at school. So, like, what can I do? We wanted to be that place that not only gave them a really clear action path, but also a place of community to meet other like-minded women to help reinforce their power. And so what started as a group of essentially 4 of us working out of our homes across Ohio is now turned into, I no longer with the group, but they're doing amazing work, and they're in 5 states. They have about 40 people on staff, and across the country, they've mobilized millions of women, not just to vote in the election, but to really form an opinion, form a point of view, and then work on achieving those points of view over the course of not just elections, but school board meetings, PTAs, neighborhood reading groups, a whole bunch of stuff. So that's been pretty cool to watch.
Wow. And it seems to have all the ingredients for the perfect formula of engagement. So you've got fun, you've got community, you've got convenience, you've got accessibility, you've got functionality, and it's no wonder that something like that would expand. Often we find with marketers, and I'm saying this with a grain of salt, but it's like sometimes you trick people into getting engaged because maybe they're not thinking they want to be engaged, but it's like, oh, here, we're gonna show you, maybe your friend's doing this and we're gonna have you involved in
Yeah,
this, and then suddenly they're in, right? And you have to think about those types of creative and compelling opportunities to connect.
exactly.
Yeah, okay. Well, Chair Elizabeth Walters, I feel like we could talk another hour, but I know you're very busy and I just really appreciate your time today. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jackie. It was great to be with you. I really appreciate it.
All right.